think about this when you're doing your Middle Woodland episode. And by the way, I think if you guys can do the Middle Woodland in 3 hours, you're going to be doing well. Okay. So
we were joking about breaking it up into the first 15 years.
So you guys always say that all my hunches work, and that's not true. And one of the hunches that I had that didn't work is this. When I started doing research here on shell middens, I had my West Coast goggles on 100%. And so when we excavated those shell middens, I thought, okay, shell middens, they're not as big as the ones on the West Coast, but this is kind of normal coastal archaeology, right? This is what coastal archaeology is supposed to be like. So when I started looking at the early woodland stuff and I started looking at the late woodland stuff, the conclusion I jumped to was that the early woodland and the late woodland were aberrant and the middle woodland was normal. And it took Susan Blair, when she was finished her master's thesis, to turn my head around and say, Dave, suppose it's the middle woodland that's weird,
right,
and the rest of it's normal.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think she's absolutely 100% right about that. And I think Matt Betts thinks that now, too, after having worked with the Porcelli stuff.
The New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast, featuring your hosts, Gabe Reinick and Ken Holyoke.
Welcome back to the New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast. I'm Gabe Reinick, and I am in southern New England today, where it's chilly and sunny outside, and I'm joined, as always, by Ken Holyoke in Lethbridge, Alberta. How are you, Ken?
Too bad. It's not chilly and sunny here. It is. We're getting a break from the smoke. So the sun looked like we were on Tatooine yesterday, and there was an air quality health index of 10 plus yesterday, which is the highest rating that Health Canada and Environment Canada can give, which means it was basically shred your lungs weather here yesterday.
Well, that's very exciting. Yeah, usually when Ken and I are doing the podcast, if it's going to be smoke filled, we prefer it to be natural with carcinogens of our own devising. Our sponsor this week is the Association of Professional Archaeologists of New Brunswick. And Ken, I understand we have some updates from Trevor on what's going on with the website.
Yeah. So our website is down, not actually due to inaction on our part, but due to the actions of our web hosting platform. They've decided to do away with their previously free model of website hosting. So we will now be seeking out a new platform, and probably what you'll see in the coming months or weeks, hopefully,
or years,
is a completely redesigned from scratch APA and B website.
Yeah, and just when you've got people with the digital competence of Ken Holyoke, me, and Trevor Dow on it, you can just rest assured that that's going to be one heck of a website. We're thinking. It's inspired by one of those old Angel Fire sites, with the little the sort of teal background and dancing emojis. It's going to be great. And so we're back from the Canadian Archaeological Association meeting, and it was great to meet a lot of you there. And we really appreciate all the listens we've had on the CAA episode. We apologize for the sound quality, but Ken and I are working on getting better at making our bar shows more audible. We feel like that's kind of actually an important skill for us, is that we need to be able to do this on the road, even in the most convivial of settings. And so we're going to keep working on that. And we also do not have a new name for this podcast. We are still, listener, the New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast. And we still, in fact, have stickers that say that, which we're still looking to offload. But we would encourage folks to send in suggestions for a new name, something a little bit more exciting for this podcast. And Ken, if the listener had a new name for this podcast, where would they email it to?
New Brunswick Archaeology at gmail.com. And as we always remind the listener, we spell archaeology ARCHAEOLOGY. And so that's the Canadiana spelling of archaeology. I think North American more generally, but
I think so.
In the States, they tend to drop the second E or second.
Yeah. Every once in a while, it seems to go away, but but we're a pretty highbrow operation here. And if the listener were to have the big winning entry, Ken, what would they receive?
Well, I thought that we're getting, we're over 1,500 listens now on the podcast.
Congratulations.
We've actually crested. This is our 11th episode, so we've actually gone. We're approaching a dozen. We're over 10 episodes, and we're looking into the future. We've just gotten through the conference season. The SAAs, the Society for American Archaeology. I think abstracts are due next Tuesday for next year's conference. And do you know where next year's conference is taking place?
I don't. Is it in New Orleans?
It's in New Orleans.
Okay.
From April 17th to the 21st. And I thought the listener might enjoy an archaeological themed cruise, maybe a journey through the American bottom. Take in a little bit of the culture of the southern parts of the United States, and traveling in style on a riverboat in the old ways, how they did it in the 19th century. And
does it have a big paddle on the front?
It has a big paddle on the back, actually. And so, so we would request that we'll arrange it so that the listener meets us in St. Louis, and I think we'll all go together to Cahokia Mounds State Park. We're going to take a little road trip down to Memphis, Tennessee, and there we're going to board the American Queen, which is at 420 feet and 6 decks, the largest steamboat ever built. And on 6 decks of grandeur, you've got the Grand Saloon, where we can see some Broadway caliber entertainment every night. We'll have pre-dinner cocktails, probably soaked in bourbon, on our way down the river.
I imagine a Sazerac is probably just the ticket for this trip.
It would be, and at the Captain's Bar, and we'll be able to lounge in style as we eat fine foods, relax on the open veranda, and view the Mississippi River as we sort of slowly meander our way down with stops at Natchez and check out some of these mound sites, Baton Rouge, and then we'll roll into New Orleans after 9 days of beautiful cruising for April 17th and take in the French Quarter. We've got some distinct connections between New Brunswick and New Orleans with the Acadian heritage in southern United States. And we'll take the listener on a journey back to 1755, and all the while, the soundtrack for that entire 9 days will be the band's Acadian Driftwood.
Yeah, the war was over, but there's no need for their spirits to be broken. That's really the motto of this show, I would say. Well, that sounds excellent, Ken. I'm certainly looking forward to that. And I know the listener is too. And so if the listener were to submit an entry to rename this podcast, where would they send it again?
To New Brunswick Archaeology at gmail.com, all one word. That's
great. But also, I mean, with the theme, we would probably accept, the entry could be taped to a bottle of Maker's Mark bourbon and mailed to either of our offices. That's fine too.
That sounds like an excellent way to gain favor with us. And if Maker's Mark is looking for a new promotional avenue, we can make it a half-empty bottle of Maker's Mark.
We can. I mean, Courvoisier is a fine beverage, but we are partial to the amber restoratives of Kentucky. And so
so that actually brings me to it's a good segue into probably one of my I think what will be my favorite listener mail that we've gotten so far. And Gabe, so we received we've got an email to share from David about Fidel's 2001 and some population stuff. But we're going to go off around that afterwards, because it actually we'll talk about it maybe a little bit in the context of what we're going to talk about in the theme today. But we got an email from Wally.
Good, Wally Ireland.
Wally Ireland, who says, "Hello from Ottawa. Thank you for both continuing to release new episodes of the podcast. Now that I truly count as a UNB alum, the fortnightly peek back into the world of academic archaeology in the Northeast is very welcome. Unfortunately, it has the two side effects of introducing threads I'd love to follow up on when I go to grad school someday, and increasing the TBR, which I'm thinking is probably to be read, pile I'd need to slog through in order to do so. As I joked about in an email to Gabe about the podcast a while ago, I made a bingo sheet that reflects the listener experience. There, and I'm so the listener can't see this, but I'm now going to share my screen with Gabe so that he can see this bingo sheet. There are 30 possible boxes.
Oh,
So
wow.
hopefully, generating a few cards will show off the complete range. I've tried to keep things relatively balanced between the two hosts, despite being better acquainted with Gabe as a former student of his. I loved the most recent episode about the CAAs, and I'm definitely interested in some of the potential future episodes you teased. The CRM and field school topics were particularly interesting because they're such an important part of archaeology that don't, in my opinion, get quite enough attention. Cheers, Wally. So thank you so much, Wally.
Yeah.
And this has to go up on Instagram, I think.
I think so.
And there are some great potential bingo. Example site is not New Brunswick. Calgary Airport Chili's. Exaggerated conversions into kilometers or Canadian dollars. Baseball reference. I like the Ken notices a weird pattern in pop culture references.
Right. How many times have we mentioned King Kong?
Well, now probably 3 or 4.
I guess so.
I like inside joke needs context.
Yeah. This
is excellent. So
yes.
I think actually our listeners need to have access to this. So we'll share both the link that Wally provided us with to the generator, and a screenshot of this particular bingo. So this is just one of many bingo placards that you can get in playing New Brunswick Archaeology podcast bingo. And I wonder if maybe our prize, we almost need to offer a prize for a bingo sheet.
I know, we're going to...
Maybe a new contest where the listener tags us on Instagram with a completed bingo sheet?
Maybe so, and then we'll have to come up with a prize.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we will think about this. This is good, Wally. Thank you very much for sending this in. Wally's a UNV alum who's an archaeologist usually in northern New England, but is working in Ontario this summer. So thanks, and thanks for listening again, Wally. This is thoughtful. Yeah.
Yeah, I was very pleased with that. So.
Yeah. Oh, that's pretty funny.
Thank you, Wally. And so we do have other listener mail, and it's from David, David MacInnes, who actually published a paper basically on population demographics, talking about the calculations that he uses for estimating population dynamics, and it was in reference to the early woodland stuff. The dates as data, evidence is about population change. It suggests population decreased during the late Archaic and increased during the early centuries of the early woodland in the Maritimes. I'm not at all confident about comparing population levels between two periods of time during which technology varied, because different technologies generate different quantities of datable material. Firing pottery created a lot of charcoal. However, archaeological periods are actually technological epochs within period comparisons can be made with more confidence. I didn't read the whole email there, but basically what David's paper was published in Archaeology of Eastern North America. I think we referenced it in the show notes for the early woodland episode.
I think we did, yeah.
And what he did is he did some calculations based on radiocarbon dates to estimate population. Is that correct?
That's right. So the premise of he did this. He's done this in Europe too, actually, but the premise is basically that, and people do this all over North America, is basically that during a time period, a greater population should produce more datable material. Therefore, archaeologists should have produced more radiocarbon, or should basically get more radiocarbon dates from those periods. So you can take like a big index of all the radiocarbon dates, run in a particular region, and use those use like the higher parts in the periods with a greater number of radiocarbon dates should correspond to a relative increase in population, is my understanding. This is almost something that we should get Dave on someday, maybe next season, to explain, as kind of a method, because I'm not doing it justice.
Yeah, totally.
But it's super interesting as an approach, and for a whole bunch of theoretical reasons involving math, it should work.
Yeah, and he was an economist by training, wasn't he?
Yes, I believe he's got a graduate degree in archaeology, but I think he also has a graduate degree in economics. He certainly knows a lot about economics and a lot about math. So, yeah,
Which is something that, if the listener hasn't noticed, Gabe and I, this is our weak suit.
yeah,
We rely on others to do the complex maths for the work that we take part in.
yeah, exactly. Money and math are not exactly things Ken and I are good at, but but such is life. So thanks very much for that, Dave. But did he have sort of a take-home point from that email? Had we erred about something, or?
So it was in the context of how we had brought up Fidel talking about using his 2001 article as an estimate for population in New York State, and the development of agriculture in New York generated a different pattern of population dynamics than in the Maritimes. Also worth mentioning is that while Fidel 2001 asserts population was lower in the early woodland relative to the late Archaic in New York, his results also indicate population grew throughout the early woodland and fell during the late Archaic. His plots tell the story. So,
awesome. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So I think his point was basically that it's hard to take two moments in time and compare them in that way. So
yeah. Cool.
And perhaps we will have an addendum and an erratum when David corrects that we misinterpreted his email.
But I'll try to remember to throw Dave's paper in the show notes again this time too, though, so the listener can check that out. It's very good.
Yeah, because it does have some bearing on today's topic.
It does, and so today's topic, we're going to talk about the Middle Maritime Woodland period, which is about 2200 to 1300 years ago. And I think there's just one of the ways that I've always thought of it. So I was talking to Art Speece once, and he kind of mentioned that one of the interesting things about this period, and the way I've kind of thought about it, is that even though for a long time people tended to think about the Middle Maritime Woodland, as Dave Black said, as a single undifferentiated adaptation spanning the years from about 2200 1300, that turns out not to be the case. And so Art pointed out to me once that there's a couple of different things that seem to radiate out from basically the Great Lakes at the beginning of this period. And we can think about this. The first kind of obvious one is dentate ceramic forms. So these are ceramics that the outside is decorated as if it's sort of with a toothed implement, like a comb, using a comb to put decorations on the outside of ceramics, or sometimes a scallop shell. Although didn't someone suggest that the scallop shell was just a comb, but used by someone that was arthritic?
Oh, that would be a lot of people with arthritis, though, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I don't know.
Pseudo scallop shell is the terminology we use. PSS. You'll see that a lot, actually.
Absolutely. But then
there's an acronym that doesn't have an A in it.
Oh yeah! Wow, good for us. And then the other thing that happens is you get the Machias Bay petroglyphs. There's our type site that it doesn't have. That's not from New Brunswick, I guess. The starts of the Machias Bay petroglyphs, the densest concentration of petroglyphs in the Northeast, and it's pre-contact petroglyphs in the Northeast. And that site is interesting in part because many of the petroglyphs appear to be in Ojibwe, following kind of Ojibwe motifs. And then you also have Wabanaki oral tradition talking about people moving, presumably from sort of the Great Lakes into the region. So you've got this kind of interesting cultural thing happening at the end of the early woodland, at the beginning of the middle woodland. And so along with this then kind of riffs on these big, what's kind of going on in North America, which is Hopewell. And so Ken, you've been thinking a lot about Hopewell lately. I know Ken and I just spent a long time in a car together, moving very, very fast in a Mercedes-Benz minivan. But Hopewell is another one of these things that we understand in part through mounds throughout the Northeast, right?
Yeah. And one of these very elaborate kind of radiating out of the Midwest, or thought to be kind of origins in the Midwest, continent-wide movements. So Hopewell, you see, there's these. I don't know who prepares these maps, but you find them, like, if you do a quick Google search for like Adena or Hopewell maps, they come up with these sort of
the really colorful ones on Wikipedia, right?
Yeah.
I have no idea who does this.
I don't know who does them, but so you can see that the influence of Hopewell extends. So we talked about Adena having kind of this sort of influence, Adena, Middlesex, kind of having this influence into the far northeast. Hopewell is less sort of concrete than what you might envision an Adena manifestation being, but Hopewell's reach is actually much larger. So I'm located out in Lethbridge here, and there are very clear indications of interactions in the Hopewell interaction sphere, even into the plains. And so, there's this sort of famous a drawing, I think is, I have it, I think it's a National Geographic thing, that shows, Knife River chert coming from, like Montana and Wisconsin. You've got obsidians from the Rockies. You've got grizzly bear teeth from the Rockies. You've got copper coming from the Great Lakes. You've got mica and shell and galena coming from various parts of the Southeast. And all of this stuff is sort of ending up at these mound sites in sort of the Ohio River Valley. But then these sort of concepts also radiate out from there. And you get things like shell becoming, shell beads are present in the early woodland, but you get shell tempering and pottery toward the end of the middle woodland, that might be something that's affiliated with this sort of shell economy. And you get very elaborate mounds that are not just earthen mounds for burials, they are effigy mounds. And so these are like, in the shape of an alligator or in the shape of a snake. You even have some middle woodland, probably Hopewell affiliated mounds in the Great Lakes region, which are called the Serpent Mounds on Rice Lake in southern Ontario. And you have things like the Great Hopewell Road, so what may be sort of this cosmographic sort of journey-scape that you have in the Ohio River Valley, where people are sort of following what they think might be the land, walking down this both built and probably figurative road that had some celestial alignment between two mound sites.
The listener can't see this, but Ken's actually wearing a fairly cosmographic shirt right now. It appears to be an Aloha shirt that was.
And I think it's between the Newark Earthworks and Chillicothe in Ohio, and what they think were people were taking these pilgrimages or religious journeys following this road. And so it is both probably a religious movement, but it's also a sort of a massive moment of exchange, and big things are happening. But the counterpart to that is that what we see in the Maritimes is participation in, to a certain degree, but also like a retraction away from things like that.
Yeah, exactly right. So that thing we just described, which sounds very, very cool, appears to have not been a huge deal in the region we're going to talk about today. Yeah. But have you ever gone and seen any of those mounds, Ken?
No, I haven't. So I've never had an opportunity to get, like, I've never been in the Midwest in the States.
Yeah. When I was in West Virginia, many of the ones in West Virginia are early woodland, but you actually get a guidebook that even gives you like parking instructions about where to go look at these. They're pretty amazing. Many of those are early woodland. I mean, there's the famous one, right? It's early woodland, probably the Grave Creek Mound in Moundsville, which is huge and impressive. The West Virginia Archaeology unit has a office and lab there. And then right across the way is the former maximum security prison, which you can also take a tour of. And the whole operation is a complete trip. I mean, but the archaeology is amazing. And so my partner and I did a tour around the region, looking at a bunch of those with this guidebook. But they're pretty amazing. And you kind of mentioned these, like the serpent mounds and stuff, which you really, from space they look like that. Standing on them they don't necessarily. So
yeah.
Yeah. So, but what we're going to see if we kind of set the stage now, I think that there's a kind of a couple things in this region, and by this region, I mean the Maritime Peninsula, that we want to think about, and some stuff that just changes in the archaeological record that are important. And one of the things is, I don't think in any great detail we've talked about shell heaps. And so many of the sites we're going to talk about today are shell heap sites. So that means that they have piles of soft shell clam, or something called shell middens, that are at them. And as the shell, which is shell that's deposited after eating shellfish, when the shell starts to break down, it releases calcium carbonate into the soil. So what happens is, the gardeners in the audience will know about Maine and the Maritimes acidic soils. The shell breaks down, calcium carbonate's released, soil becomes more basic. So this means that on the coast during this time period, as long as there's shell at these sites, we actually get pretty good preservation, especially of food remains. So of animal bones from what people were eating.
So you were just explaining what's on the coast.
Mm-hmm.
You were about to say what's happening on the interior.
Yes.
And then when you're done that, I'm going to tell people where we are in time.
Oh, that's a good plan. Sounds good. Sounds good. Because that's where we are in time is kind of an important part of this, I guess.
Yeah.
But what this means in part is that we've got significant differences in the archaeological record on the coast versus the interior, where stuff isn't preserving very well. And so figuring out these kinds of differences that might relate to, say, are there two distinct populations, one living on the coast, one living on the interior? What are the interactions between those groups? I mean, they clearly be related. It's clearly be long-term occupation, year-round occupation on the coast and the interior. But what the exact natures of those populations, or what Dave Sanger called the two-population model, are somewhat difficult to figure out, in part because of those preservation issues. And Ken is now going to tell us where we are in time, which I realize I forgot to do earlier.
So we, just to contextualize what the Middle Maritime Woodland is, we generally start at around 2200 calibrated years before present, and it sort of ends around 1300 years ago. And there's a little bit of nuance there. So in the Lower Wolastoq, for example, you start to see some changes probably closer to 1500 years ago. But I think more and more, as we'll talk about probably later in this episode and certainly in the next episode, the middle to late maritime woodland transition almost is a thing in and of itself, and that is that sort of period between about 1500 to 1300 years ago ish.
Yeah.
But yeah, so 2200 years ago is kind of when we're picking up.
Sometimes we step outside of time, and it's weird. You can tell Ken is sort of he has to grab hold of the desk, and that the G forces become substantial.
You see my cheeks rippling.
Yeah, exactly. Please, Ken, it's a family podcast. So we've talked a little bit about the kind of big picture. We've talked a little bit about the transition from the early woodland to the middle woodland in this region. But I think one of the things that we are, the two kind of tensions I think that we're going to talk about a little bit here, is that one of the key realizations of recent archaeological work in Maine and the Maritimes is that we have a lot more resolution on change within the woodland period. So changes between 3,000 years ago and European contact. We understand these much better than we used to, and we've got a lot more nuance about culture change during that period. But the other thing that Ken and I are going to have a hard time doing when we try to discuss this with you is that becomes more site location redundancy. So a lot of the sites that we're actually going to talk about this fortnight are going to be the same ones we'll talk about in 14 days, because a lot of the important sites have both middle woodland and late woodland and even protohistoric components at them.
Yeah, and in some cases you'll recognize, particularly for the interior, when we talk about the Lower Wolastoq and places like the Miramichi River, that these sites are actually occupied from probably the transitional Archaic, but certainly by the early woodland through through to the post-contact period. And so what you're seeing are people staying in particular places in the landscape for a longer period of time. And you're starting to see a little bit in places like New Brunswick of the kind of stratified sites, like what sort of characterize Maine prehistory, for example, right? Like, although in Maine you have places like Brigham and Sharrow where you've got a record from sort of the Middle Archaic right through to contact in one sort of stratified deposit. But what we're seeing here is certainly these landscapes are occupied, but we see a little bit more kind of shingling, chronological shingling in occupation of sort of archaic and then woodland landscapes. And the listener will also want to take note too that we're now operating in much smaller frames of time, right? So when we talk about not knowing as much about certain time periods, you got to remember when we were, our early maritime archaic episode covered a period of what, 6,000 years?
Something like that, yeah.
Somewhere around there. And we're now talking about 900 years, right? So yeah. We do actually we're starting to have increasing chronological resolution. And going back to what Gabe said at the start is that there had been this kind of interpretation that what we see at the start of the Middle Maritime Woodland was essentially what the rest of the woodland was, right? Like the notion of if I'm not saying this incorrectly, I think this whole premise of the Quoddy tradition was that starting at about 2,200 years ago, you were seeing undifferentiated cultural material that spanned basically from that time period, from sort of what were really detectable increase in ceramics, changes in projectile point morphology in coastal sites in the Quoddy region, right up until contact. And some of that was a function of the visibility of particular sites, but also as Gabe talked about, shell-bearing information and how you can detect changes through time in these shell-bearing sites, which traditionally there was, I would say, a pessimism about the ability to tell time through these stratified deposits. Is that correct? Or that they weren't viewed as stratified deposits?
I think that's right. Yeah, and so we recently when we were at the CAA, Dave Black won a Smith-Wittenberg Award, and one of the things that came up in the nomination was the degree to which his contribution to understanding stratigraphic integrity within shell-midden sites was important, not just in New Brunswick, but but is important throughout the Northeast, because there were these huge debates going on in the literature about whether or not you could infer basically stratigraphic layers within shell heaps and whether or not stuff moved in shell heaps. And so was it I think it was Louis Brennan and working in New York, David Sanger, and they were writing papers, things like with titles like "The Midden is the Message," a little Marshall McLuhan reference there, and then Bruce Bork and Dina Dinkows had a big back and forth in the Review of Archaeology, and then you had the sort of more I guess optimistic voices in this debate, Art Spiess, and then in particular I think David Black, who really sort of showed that you can in fact use these visible strata in shell heaps to figure out change through time. And that kind of fundamental realization became important for understanding all the transitions that we're going to talk about over the last few thousand years. There are shell heaps that are older than that in the region. So at places like Turner Farm, where the site goes back 5,500 years, and then you get shell heaps, and there's certainly
around 4,000 years ago, isn't it? As early as, or is that?
Yeah, so the oldest radiocarbon date at Turner Farm is, I think, 5,500.
But the shell is
after that.
Shell's associated with the Susquehanna occupation, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
There's our another main.
That's telephone booth shaped look. Yeah.
Your bingo dabber is going to be dry by the time this episode's over.
Exactly.
What's it called when the whole sheet is full?
Is that? Oh, I don't know. It's We should. I was just thinking we should also try to get this. We should try to get on an advertisement on Radio Bingo. That the like rural New Brunswick thing.
What?
Have you
What's
never
that?
heard, a mutual friend of ours was telling me about Radio Bingo. It's apparently it's bingo on the radio, I guess.
Oh, I
So
I didn't know this.
yeah, so I mean, it's like you could sit in a smoke-filled bingo parlor, but instead you sit at home. And so I guess it's like the antisocial version of bingo. I don't entirely understand it, but I'm told it's very popular on the Miramichi.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, but what isn't popular on the Miramichi?
Exactly.
It's the Ohio of New Brunswick. And, and so okay, so we've really done a good job here. We've instead of, do you remember how we were like talking? We're like, oh yeah, we're gonna just take the woodland period in really narrow chunks. So instead, we've just been pushing this back further. And listener, we'd like to talk to you about the nature of time. Time gets shorter as it gets closer. Time is bigger in the past. So everything's under control. Don't worry, we're highly trained podcast professionals and public educators. But so the point is that we thought we had a difficult time figuring out stratigraphic layers in coastal sites, and it turns out you can do it, which is great. And so as a result, we're going to talk about changes within this last period. I think you could even, since we've broadened time, we might as well broaden space again. But part of what we've talked about when we're talking about the early woodland was that we understand this in some sense, the woodland period, as I think there's kind of two narratives that we understand. One is that it's very similar to the Neolithic in the old world. So this idea that you've got this kind of suite of stuff, right? People settling down, people starting to grow crops, forms of domestication. And then also in North America, this understanding that this is kind of the time period that we understand from European accounts, basically. This is the sort of time period that Europeans encounter. But so as a result, the narrative of this period was very, very smushed together, where you understood the whole thing in terms of stuff that actually didn't happen all at the same time. Is that fair, Ken?
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I think we'll probably want to before we kind of leap into um, other Middle Maritime Woodland, we'll also probably maybe do a little bit of a sort of a rehash on hunter-gatherer theory and sort of thinking about how hunter-gatherers live on the landscape and how we have come to define how they sort of move around the landscape, right? And so the big narrative about hunter-gatherers is sort of mobility and settlement, and so what kinds of houses and places do they live, and what kind of site information, like what is the static manifestation of what is it, of dynamic cultural activity? Isn't that the line or something like that?
Yeah, I can't remember.
There's some Binfordian anyway. So Lewis Binford, who's sort of a kind of the key figure in this sort of hunter-gatherer spectrum. And so we talked about this, I think, early on in the show about how we define hunter-gatherers on a spectrum from foragers, so highly mobile people who move around the landscape, to collectors who are more settled, tend to stay in one location for longer periods of time.
The listener can't tell. We've continued. It's always a good sign when, after saying that we're gonna try to stop talking about time, and then Ken says, "Let's talk a little bit about hunter-gatherer theory." So let's go. Let's start at 200,000 years ago. With anatomically and cognitively modern humans.
I'm not sure how I chopped this up, but Gabe raised a point that basically up until now we've seen sort of characteristically residentially mobile populations, and that groups are sort of moving around the landscape and moving their houses at different times of the year, sort of exploiting different ecological niches and different resources at different times of the year, moving around the landscape. And so we see a continuation of that into the Middle Woodland, but toward the end of the Middle Woodland, what we're starting to see is a change in that behavior. And some of what we're going to talk about today in the context of the Middle Woodland maybe kind of sets the stage for why that is. Maybe it's a reaction to something. And so I think that we have opened the show with a couple quotes from Dave Black at the Luna Rogue last week, or a couple weeks ago, I guess.
Yeah.
And in complement to that, Dave talks about how he and Sue Blair kind of had a conversation about what's going on in the Middle Woodland, and how, there was this notion that Middle Woodland kind of represented sort of the normal, right? Like, this is what people are doing. Whereas what Dave talks about, and what Sue has talked about, is that maybe the Middle Woodland is actually a little bit different in that there's a quote here from Sue's thesis. It appears to be remarkable for its localized character, its internal consistency, and the apparent disengagement of regional groups from developments in the broader Northeast. And I think that is, we'll kind of probably come back to this a number of times today, and sort of what characterizes the Middle Woodland as being a little bit different than what we were seeing in the early Woodland, and certainly what we'll see in the years following sort of 1500 to 1300 years ago. So
That's right. Yeah.
So we've talked about shell deposits and shell-bearing sites, and I think that it's probably we're gonna start by talking about somewhere not in New Brunswick, and we're gonna talk about certainly probably one of Gabe's favorite spots, and one of mine after being down there for a couple field seasons on Gabe's master's and PhD research on the south shore of Nova Scotia, in a very beautiful place called Port Jolly Harbor. And so maybe we'll bring in Matt Betts' thoughts on what's going on with shell-bearing sites there.
Yeah, so and we'll link to this book in the show notes. But this is kind of an important book called Placemaking in the Pretty Harbor. Ken and I both have chapters in it, which is fun. But it's edited by Matt Betts, good friend and colleague at Canadian Museum of History. And what Matt was doing out there was, there's Port Jolly is on the south shore of Nova Scotia, which is a beautiful place. It's got ticks the size of small helicopters, which is not great. But other than that, it's lovely. And
they're also like they're so prolific there that it is the most like, I've never had a tick removed more casually than the cook at the Harrison Lewis Center, barely breaking a stride as she's chopping up tomatoes fiercely, looks over, flicks a tick off of my shin when I realized I had one there, washes her hands, and goes right back to chopping tomatoes. Like, it was like the knife didn't even stop moving, and she had already removed the tick from my shin.
That's great. Yeah, she could do it with the knife too, I think, but she didn't want to alarm you. The quick. And so what Matt did, and this is kind of, it's like the project's incredibly good, multidisciplinary, tons of good sites, and basically a bunch of sites have been reported from Port Jolly Harbor, and they basically, in the Middle Woodland is when the harbor itself formed. So the becomes the kind of harbor as we understand it now, and then almost immediately ancestral Mi'kmaq people start living there. But one of Matt's insights was that there were essentially two kinds of coastal sites there. And the first kind of site were these deep processing middens, or shell heaps, lots of soft shell clam and animal bones, lots of charcoal, but very little in the way of features. And then there was a second kind of site that tended to be located just a little bit inland from these, that were associated with house floors, which are basically the stains on the ground left by wigwams in the past, so small oval stains. Ken and I spent a long time in one at Port Jolly Harbor, actually. And then these would have small middens around them, so sort of your kitchen middens. There's an unpronounceable Danish word with a lot of J's and M's and K's and stuff that refers to those kinds of middens. And so this is kind of one. So once you think about this kind of structure of the archaeological record, then you can start to say, okay, well, what's going on? And these deep processing middens, Matt thinks, may have to do in some cases with aggregation. So families coming together, processing shells, and then actually probably smoking and storing some of the meat from these shellfish, right? Which is interesting because kind of your classic highly residentially mobile hunter-gatherers are implied by, if this is correct, by to be doing some things that we don't usually associate with hunter-gatherers. So, and those things are,
Storage.
year-round. With storage, right? It's the they call them hunter-gatherers, not hunter-storers. So that's sort of interesting. It's what's going on. And the other thing that we learned about the Middle Woodland from these sites in Port Jolly were the only pre-contact sweat houses from the region. So sweat houses are what they sound like, right? But there's a bunch of different kinds in the ethnohistoric literature, different kinds of sauna adjacent things. And the one rather in Port Jolly was a sort of deep hole. It's probably a men's space from the ethnohistoric record. And there were all sorts of reasons that people used sweat houses. So they could be a kind of preventative medicine. They could be, so you sort of go in just to kind of, keep the system going. Or you could also use them to treat various kinds of ailments. People probably took certain kinds of drugs while they were in them. And you could also use them as a kind of sort of shamanism, right? Which is basically, I wish I could remember who said this, but someone described shamanism as kind of religious first aid, right? It's like one of the things that you want to do if you're kind of out of whack with the way things should be going, which is important in hunter-gatherer religious or cosmological systems.
Yeah, and we talked about how some of these overt burial ceremonialism and that sort of thing might be ways people are negotiating their worlds and sort of understanding change in their landscape and bringing order to their worlds through what we see in material culture, and certainly sweat lodges and sweat houses might be one of these places where this sort of space is important.
Totally. Yeah, no, I think that's true. One of the other big insights of this work, and so we should say that these sites are somewhat different than the ones in New Brunswick, like the Middle Woodland sites that like Dave Black worked at in the Quoddy region, or I worked at in the main Quoddy region, aren't spatially arranged like this. They tend to be all mushed together a little bit more, where you've got the living features and the shell heaps interdigitated. The listener can't see, but I made the interdigitated finger gesture, which I know everyone appreciates. But one of the things is that people have tended to be really dismissive about the importance of shellfish. Ken, do you like eating shellfish?
I love shellfish.
Oh yeah, me too.
I discovered actually the beauty of shellfish actually when you and Nadine were living in Biddeford.
Oh yeah.
And we went down to that the market in Portland, and we got all the we got the oysters from each different bay along the main coast, and we did like a terroir tasting, and I didn't realize that like the same species could have such a remarkably different flavor and character. And man, those Damariscatas though, they're the bee's knees.
That's funny. That was a good day. We should do that again. We should do a live live from a seafood restaurant show. It might be a little it's possible that that's not what the listener wants to hear, is us slurping oysters while we
we'll mute when we slurp. But
mute when we slurp.
The listener would also, there's a great colloquialism that we got out of there though. And that's that in New Brunswick, the listeners will recognize when I say a canner lobster, you can probably visualize sort of this like small sort of pound and a quarter, very tasty lobsters. Actually, I really like canners, but I don't think actually they sell them any. I think you're not allowed to catch canners in New Brunswick.
I don't know.
Anyway, the fishmonger was that was at the counter. When I asked her to bag up, I think it was like 3 canner lobsters. She had no idea what I was talking about. And I said, oh, the small ones, like pound and a quarter. And she goes, oh, you're talking about chicken lobsters. And then she dutifully bagged everything up as we're picking out oysters, and then called my number, and I went over to pick them up. And she hands me the bag, and she goes, here's your canners. Ha!
The listener will appreciate, maybe the listener doesn't know Ken as well as I do, but being in a situation with Ken in which we're communicating with someone who clearly has no idea what we're talking about. So Ken just speaks with increasing confidence until they come along. I've even seen him do this in French, actually, and looking for a bagel shop in French. And so no, it's the same experience whether you're in a Starbucks, a shellfish shop, whatever, at the Metro in Montreal. So, but but it turns out shellfish are really important to the diet in the Middle Woodland. They're kind of not a last resort food. And do you remember? I'm not really sure why people were so dismissive of shellfish as a food source. I suspect part of it might be that in the ethnographic accounts, they're often collected by women and children. They seem,
could be,
yeah. Individually, they're pretty small.
But wasn't it like Carson didn't Sanger like recover a ton of terrestrial bone, and so it didn't seem like it was possible. Like, maybe it was just sort of the thinking that like if terrestrial resources are available, like the meat weight of a shellfish would be far outclassed by like a caribou, for example, right? Like,
yeah,
that you spend half a day hunting for caribou and you get meat for weeks, versus go out with your whatever. What do you think a clam rake looked like? Like, what was the clamming technology?
This is a great question, and I don't know. So
one of the things that we talked about in this Port Jolly volume. So I co-wrote the lithics chapter, and I didn't have a chance to look at the lithics themselves, but they had some sort of cursory.
So Ken did look at the pictures, though, listener. He didn't just make this up.
I love the pictures, and I had very detailed databases that were prepared by a student who was working with Matt. And one of the patterns that emerged was that there's an increasing, and this is elsewhere in the Maritimes, is that you get an increase in small scraping tools proliferating throughout the middle and late maritime woodland. And some of that may be, for example, in coastal sites, associated with like processing shellfish, because you don't need an elaborate tool to scrape, a clam out of a shell, basically, right? But you do need a sharp edge. And when you see all of these small lithic flakes, so like the small byproducts of making a stone tool that are either sharpened on one edge or show wear, so when you look at them under a microscope and they show sort of characteristic chipping and wear or polish, that they're what we would call a utilized flake or a retouched flake, those would be ideal for processing these shellfish. But it's like we don't really see anything, like you don't see like groundstone objects or tools that would have been used. It's like maybe they were like sticks or something, like something perishable that I guess wouldn't show up.
Yeah,
but
I've always said that Ken's lithic chapter really shucks. So, but no, I don't know. I mean, but I think you're raising this point, right? That there's so much we just don't really know. Like we don't know that much about fishing technology either, really.
No.
Like the amount of fish versus the amount of stuff we would think of for catching fish is out of whack. Yeah. I mean, while we're talking about stuff we don't know, we don't really even know what people on the interior were eating, right? I mean, we can infer it, but
that's true. They may have been eating shellfish, but we don't see it, for example, right? Like
if they're keeping the shell somewhere else.
Yeah. And so Gabe, alongside these deep processing middens, what's interesting too is the site locations, and they have to do with, lo and behold, proximity to shellfish.
Yeah. So, bunch of people, Kellogg, Dave Black, Matt Betts, made the site locational models. And so what a site locational model is it's a model imposed by archaeologists to try to figure out where people tended to put their sites, right? And so one of the keys was that because shellfish were so crucial to the diet, maybe greater than 90% of the diet at places like Indian Town Island in Maine, greater than 80% of the diet at the Kidder Point site in Maine, maybe 35 to 95% of the diet at various Quoddy region sites in New Brunswick. People are actually putting their sites near highly productive clam flats. So places where you would be able to get lots of soft shell clam, and also other aspects of sites that indicate real affiliation to just using watercraft on the coast. So good places to land a canoe, it's key in this understanding. And also,
And in the
Right.
interior too, you get locations at like would have been great locations for fish runs, for hunting waterfowl. So we'll talk about a couple sites in the like a series of sites in the Grand Lake Meadows region and in the Lower Wolastoq, which are this is, as Gabe and I learned one year, duck hunting territory, and probably had been for several millennia. So
Yeah. They
I also apologize to the listener. There's somebody mowing their lawn across the street from me, so if you hear an odd humming in the background, I'm going to try to mute and limit the background noise here. But it's I'm not sort of doing a deep throaty hum in the background. That is indeed an ambient sound.
Ken's just aspirating his yeses constantly. It's um so and people tend to be on these roughly south facing pieces of shoreline. And so one of the reason this pieces of information is useful is if you're actually out looking, if you're an archaeologist trying to find sites, you can use these models. I mean, you want to be careful and test off the model every once in a while to make sure you're not just, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy if you only look where you think sites are going to be, and then you're like, oh, look, my model was fantastic. I only found sites where I thought they would be.
You need to sample the quadrat.
Yeah, exactly. It's been a long time since I've thought about quadrats, Ken.
Yep.
I'm not even sure I remember what a quadrat is.
I don't know if it's actually got if there's like a physical size that's supposed to be, but I think it's basically just supposed to be when you're doing probabilistic testing of a certain area, you break up a landscape. You use like Cartesian planes to sort of lay over a landscape, and you say like each of these boxes is a certain size, and that you call those quadrats. So
Yeah.
it could be like a 5 by 5 kilometer area, or 500 meter by 500 meter area. And
yeah,
that's
in
like
the imperial system, that's an octarat that we use. It's got even more sides.
what was the French version? The arpent.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Which sounds like a high-end cigarette lighter,
Yeah.
Yeah. And we're back with the new. But so we've got these site locational models. People are putting their living areas on these ones. In the Quoddy region, we've done, and by we I mean Dave Black, in the bad old days before, like try to explain to you and me now that I'm going to go take students in a boat and do island survey. It would be the look in the dean's eyes, or the more likely the insurance actuary's eyes when I explained what I was going to do in a boat with a bunch of 20-year-olds.
Yeah, I think Sue tells the story about them basically disappearing into the fog one day, and they're puddling around in a small outboard boat, and not really sure which, like, pointed the boat in a direction that they thought was mainland.
Yeah, they no, it seems like it'd be pretty hard to do. I mean, and then once you're out there, you're just out there, for a long time.
It is absolutely beautiful boating around in there, though. That is
Yeah.
like touring around on those islands. I've been lucky to go out at least once with a friend of ours, and kind of see these places up close, and you can totally see why the Quoddy became such an attractive place to live too.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and there's actually, we should mention there are other reasons in New Brunswick too that the Quoddy region was such a fantastic place to live, and one of those things is coastal upwelling that's driving nutrients basically driving nutrients up in the Quoddy region. So it's a really ecologically rich area to live in. So you've got shellfish, but you've also got the other kinds of food that people are eating there. So on the coast you get eels, ducks, and geese, and but you also still have your terrestrial resources too. Your cervids.
And it's also
mammals.
too why the Lower Wolastoq and the Miramichi River, for example, were such great locations for people to live, because they were equally, so they're what are called estuaries, and so they are many of the sites that cluster in around like Metapenaugiag, for example, or in the Lower Wolastoq and around the Grand Lake Meadows are within the tidal range or the tidal amplitude for the Wolastoq River or the Miramichi River, and therefore as a result you have sort of the best of both worlds. You've got freshwater species. You've got some anadromous fish species, so fish that are kind of moving up and down the river, like for example salmon or sturgeon. And then you have a number of other. You've got migratory birds coming through both of these areas, and then you have uplands with abundant terrestrial resources. And because of the sort of estuary, you get different plant life too. So you get a number of unique biotic communities that would produce plants that are both edible and also medicinal. And so these are sort of like hotbeds for both coastal areas and interior estuarine areas are sort of ideal locations to kind of make as a base of operations.
Absolutely, and we indicated, and I guess we should indicate in slightly more detail here that people are living on the coast year round during the woodland period, and so the inferring hunter-gatherers seasonality is difficult. And
I thought you just cut open the contrafor, isn't that the?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the listener can't see, but as I said, hunter-gatherer seasonality. I am now looking at a half-finished bottle of Courvoisier. This is kind of scarring experience, and so you basically, because the easiest way to do this, right, and what might just be the best way to do this is you say, okay, in the shell midden, there's particular kinds of animals that I know are most available at particular times of year. So if you've got tomcod in your midden, you say, okay, it's probably a cold season habitation rather than a warm season one, because that's when you would collect tomcod, or fish tomcod, I guess would be a better phrase. There are other ways though that you can try to figure out seasonality. So you can do stable isotope analyses on various things. And if the listener would like to know what stable isotopes are, I would encourage them to Google it.
I was going to say, you better not send this my way. I can't answer that question.
Ken, would you like to tell us about strontium today? And Ken just threw himself under a lawnmower, ladies and gentlemen. It's but you can use, I mean, in particular, you use oxygen isotopes to, what you're actually doing is you're inferring past water temperature, and then you can use the water temperature to estimate what seasonality was. But the astute listener will already identify that there's a problem with that, which is that in the spring and the fall, you're likely to have very similar water temperatures. So then you're back to trying to nuance this by adding information from your season of capture anyway on these animals. But a bunch of accumulated, and you can section deer teeth, that are available at particular times of the year, that will look differently at different times of the year. So you can use all these data, right? And basically all of these accumulated data have come together. We're still obviously working on these problems to make clear that people are living along the coast year round. That doesn't mean they're living at one site necessarily, although they certainly at places like Port Jolly appear to be at one site for long periods of time.
Yeah.
But they're moving around the coast, and in particular in the Quoddy region, they're moving between islands and the coast of the mainland. Yeah.
So, and on the interior, you just see a site and you say, well, they can't have lived here between, April and mid-June because it's underwater. And then you hope that you recover stuff like ceramic vessels, for example, where there was a study done by Vincent Bourgeois and a group of Dave Black and Sue Blair and a couple other folks from Archaeological Services, where they collected residues from the interiors of ceramic vessels, primarily middle woodland pots. There are a couple like late woodland pots in there. And they did this isotopic analysis, which seemed to indicate that groups were consuming freshwater and anadromous fish and migratory birds, which would suggest that at least these vessels are probably summer sites. But what we know is that groups were probably living in the interior year round, and they may have been moving into places like the Grand Lake Meadows region, maybe in the summer because it's a very ecologically rich area in the summer. But as we know, as the listener who is from New Brunswick knows, the Wolastoq has a spring freshet, and so there are significant areas along the river that flood during the spring, and so you're probably not living there for at least a couple months but you're probably coming in as soon as those those fiddleheads pop up and the water recedes, and living there probably well into the fall, and if not, maybe throughout the winter. But the other thing that we use outside of faunal remains to kind of understand where people were living and when is the density of artifacts that you might recover in a particular feature context. So if, for example, you're excavating something that you suspect is a household, you would, by sort of proxy, understand a greater concentration of things inside a house as probably evidence of groups being inside more frequently or for longer periods of time, in which case you can probably interpret that as being sort of a winter occupation. And in Port Jolly, there's this excellent example from ALDF 24, where there's an incredibly dense concentration of artifacts inside at least one of the house floors, because there's sort of several occupations there. But sometimes you don't see that sort of concentration on sites in the interior, which suggests that people were maybe moving around a little bit more, and maybe not where I can't think of off the top of my head a particular location on the interior where you'd say, oh yeah, this is probably like an overwintering campsite.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the problems on the interior too is just that the features in general are poorly defined. I mean, so we don't really have good evidence for house features on the interior like we do on the coast.
Yeah. And so with the listener, so when we're talking about like the visibility of features or the distinctiveness of features, we're actually talking about like how easy they are to see. And so the soils, for example, in the interior, you don't have the kind of contrasts, for example, in features that you might have on the coast. At Gemseg, I think they kind of famously talk about how you closed your eyes and you sort of felt with your trowel to sort of detect textural differences in what would probably be the edges of features. One of the sites that I looked at for my master's, for example, there was a hearth feature that we had some charcoal concentrations, but was actually very hard to see in the field. Like, these things are not easy to see, whereas the house floor that Gabe mentioned that we spent a lot of time on, or in Port Jolly, you could stand up on this glacial erratic right beside it, and you could see visibly that there was a difference between what was inside the house, which was a lot of crushed shell and very black soil, and what was outside the house, which was kind of like gray to brown soil and very high contrast, to the point that like you could actually I think you and Matt laid down a string essentially and found the outside of the house, and then were able to find secondary features like the rocks that were clustered around where the poles for your wigwam would be placed, and that stuff is all highly visible, but you don't see that as much on the interior, so it's a little bit more difficult to identify these types of features.
Yeah, and so that means that when archaeologists are trying to figure out, I mean, this is a theme we've just we keep returning to, right? Is the relationship between the coast.
The Amazon man just stopped by.
Oh wow, yeah. Ken's house is the hub of activity in Lethbridge, Alberta today. It's a tumbleweed just rolled through his living room, and he's the listener can't see this, but in addition to wearing a shirt that's traveling through time, he's got how many gallons is that hat, Ken, or maybe liters for the Canadian audience?
I think the standard is it would be it'd be 42 liters or something like that.
I think it must be a 42-liter hat. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you wearing spurs? I can't tell. Or does Carolyn make you take those off before you come in the house?
No, it would scratch up the floor.
Yeah.
So. But I have my buckle on. It's such a large buckle. I'm actually having trouble sitting down. It's pinching my belly button, but it shows my my Albertaness.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably pretty comfortable, though, since your office chair is a saddle. So I just think we should get APA and B belt buckles. That should be the next swag.
That would be good. I mean, we could get New Brunswick Archaeology podcast buckles too.
That's a great idea.
We also should come up with a slogan. So APA and B has an excellent slogan.
Yeah.
And I don't know if we can.
Are we allowed to say it on a family podcast?
I don't know. I don't want to get the E rating. When Apple reviews this episode.
But if we say it slowly, will you be able to bleep it out, and then we won't get in trouble?
So if I go like
Yeah, exactly. Well, so that the slogan is experts, not Right. Okay. I wasn't sure if we were allowed to say that.
Well,
We just did.
I bet you there's a bleep function that I can do here.
Yeah. No, I bet you're right. That was your line, right? You were describing Darcy Dignam's excellent performance on the CBC, I think, right?
I don't know. Was that my line or was that Darcy's line?
I can't remember. All I know is it wasn't mine, and I wished it had been. So once I hit that point of resentment, I just didn't care about somebody else. But no, yeah, and experts not assholes actually is the attitude, the APNB. They're not paying extra for this spot, but that's the attitude. It's sort of the happy warrior thing that we're going for, where
we try to take the high road and do things for the betterment of the discipline in the process.
Yeah, no, the astute listener will notice that we've never taken a subtle dig at anyone via an inside joke on this podcast, and we just simply wouldn't. I mean, that's beneath all of our dignity.
It's true.
Yeah, we respect the listener, we respect the discipline. And I'm reminded, whenever I think about what to do, I'm reminded by this, gigantic bust of Caesar we have parked in here about what the appropriate behavior is.
I'll have to talk to Manu about getting those printed up.
That'd be great. So also listener, if other suggestions about busts you think we should install here at the NB ArcPod studio, we're happy to entertain those. You know the email address.
And we're doing a really good job here. Dave Black was actually not confident that we could do the Middle Woodland in less than 3 episodes, and it's a good thing you have somewhere to go this afternoon.
That's right.
So year-round occupation on the coast, probably year-round occupation on the interior, but less visible.
Yeah.
And so what are people making? So we talked about that we don't know what a clam fork is in the pre-contact world, but and we talked a little bit about decoration on ceramics, but
yep.
What really characterizes the Middle Woodland is actually the proliferation of ceramics, right? So it's kind of the CP 2, 3, and 4.
Yeah.
Our Middle Woodland, and this, but I think probably CP 3 is sort of the hallmark of Middle Woodland ceramics, because that's kind of sort of scallop and dentate and all that.
Yeah,
kind of
I mean,
stuff mixed together, and you certainly, when you recover ceramics in an archaeological context, the vast majority of those ceramics are coming from Middle Woodland contexts.
That's right. Yeah. So like at Sip Bay, where we worked last season, we were getting essentially.
This is yet another
in Maine. Sorry.
Example.
The listener doesn't know. I haven't dug a test pit in New Brunswick in a decade. Actually, this is like the equivalent.
Slip.
What's that?
You shouldn't let that slip. That's
No, it's more effective. It makes this like sports talk radio, where it's like the guys never actually played baseball or hockey or whatever, but they're happy to talk about it.
Gabe had Tommy John surgery back 10 years ago, and hasn't been able to move his trowel in New Brunswick since.
Exactly. Yeah, I used to be good for 25 test pits a day before the the ligaments went. But I mean, if you looked at collections from New Brunswick, so that counts.
Exactly.
We looked at a collection recently together, and that I renewed my New Brunswick cred. Well, we're still on topic, aren't we? So we need.
So talk about ceramics at Sip Bay.
Yeah, so but that and so you get basically, like, we even at SIP had essentially whole pot drops where we've got these dentate and pseudoscallop shell forms, as if you basically just drop the pot there. I mean, and that's kind of unique, but the abundance of ceramics, and the ceramics are bigger. They typically get bigger sherds. You get more of them in the archaeological record, and that's true at other Middle Woodland sites.
And the pots themselves are generally larger, are they not? Like, they're not. I don't think anything is as big as Vinette pots, but
Oh, they're bigger than the Vinet 1 pots. Yeah,
Oh, they are. Okay.
they are.
Okay.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
had I had that kind
Typically.
of mixed up. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's my understanding. And I mean, again, in New Brunswick, that's based on the 6 sherds of Vinet 1 pottery or something, right?
We may have found more though. That's
That's
the
right.
site the collection that we were looking at.
That's right.
And so and the sort of in situ sort of feature of all these ceramic sherds in one spot. You do find that in the interior as well. So the Meadow site, which we'll talk about here in a moment, had particular features that look to be sort of entire pots kind of located in one area. You know, it's not super common practice anymore, but one of the things that I thought was probably one of the coolest aspects of a field school that I got to do, these were not Middle Woodland pots. These were pots from a mine site, basically, in Belize. But we got to do ceramic reconstruction. And in lithics, kind of the coolest thing you can do is refit an artifact back together. But ceramic reconstruction is actually sort of the funnest puzzle you'll ever do. And so when you find these sort of broken pots all in one spot, you're actually, in some case, you can sort of refit them into and rebuild this pot to actually see the shape and size of it. But you can also, with these small fragments of the pottery vessels, which are sherds, these are the broken fragments of a pottery vessel. You can look at the contour of these particular sherds. You can look at the decoration on the outside of them and on the inside of them. You can look at the collar and rim pieces. So the sort of the top of the pot is the rim. The collar is the part that sort of pinches in and then before flaring out into the body. And you can look at all these attributes, and we've talked about the ceramic period. We've sort of introduced this concept. But by looking at these decorations and looking at these designs, looking at the temper, so the material that actually goes into making the pot itself, we can actually kind of distinguish very easily within smaller time frames than just the Middle Maritime Woodland. We can actually distinguish within the Middle Maritime Woodland or estimate how old those particular sites are. And that's sort of when you find ceramics on any archaeological site in the Maritimes, because we have this the Peterson and Sanger ceramic sequence, which has been sort of refined by Vincent Bourgeois as well as Cora Woolsey, sort of some regionalism to it. We can actually sort of winnow down whether it was an earlier Middle Maritime Woodland site or a later Middle Maritime Woodland site, which is a great is very helpful for us to understand sort of what's going on at particular moments of time, and at the sort of century scale as opposed to millennial scale.
That's great. Yeah, and so we should talk about the lithics a little bit too.
Yeah. So so the last note that we had, just to talk, we talked about pseudoscallop, didn't we? PSS already.
We did. Yeah.
Yeah. So
the listen, we really like using that abbreviation pseudo scallop because there's nothing quite like using a letter that at least sounds different than the one. It's unfortunately there are no pterodactyl motifs. We could really get confused.
My daughter, they call all these, they call them sneaky letters. So that would be
but that's spelled
P.
PSNE.
Yeah. Yeah. So that'd be a sneaky P on pseudo.
Oh, I bet.
So along with ceramic motifs being kind of similar to other places in the Northeast, we also have, there are very few sort of characteristic Middle Woodland sort of diagnostic points. So we had these side notch points in the early woodland and some other forms. What we do see, though, are things like what's called a Jack's Reef point. Jack's Reef. And these are...
That joke was funny to exactly 2 of our listeners, Kat.
Yeah,
the wish of it, yeah.
Another ESAF reference right there.
Yeah.
That's 2 bingo slots in one phrase.
Yeah. We're gonna have to get Wally in the van to Ocean City on the trip to ESAF next year, so that he can, understand, have even more of these ESAF references. That maybe the whole show is an ESAF reference, and Wally will have to go to know. Yeah.
Yeah. We should have done a pod shot from inside the truck. I guess you were driving, so next time we're gonna have to have a driver.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with trying to do that while I'm not driving is that I'm likely to be vomiting, based on my profound motion sickness in even the gentlest of traveling scenarios. But yeah, we could,
We could do it on a
pause.
train. I guess we could try to find a train.
Train would be fine. Yeah, I could do
Yeah.
train. But we could get one of those big boom, like we were talking about one of those boom mics, where it's on the arm or whatever, and we could just like rotate the mic around. Or we could do it like a 1950s mono folk or country music recording where there's just one mic hanging from the middle of the van, and we're all around it, singing the beautiful harmonies that are New Brunswick archaeology, and the harmonious nature of this, and then just how well all of the many voices working in this region just come together to produce clear archaeological narratives.
That is beautiful. We
Yeah,
did try that though in a bar, and it did not work very well.
That's true. Listener, we know that we tried very hard, and by we I mean Ken tried very hard to make that sound good, and we've learned some lessons that we might need more microphones. We might need to get those like sportscaster microphones, with like the big earphones and the mic that goes in front.
That actually wouldn't be a bad idea.
Yeah, I don't think that's a terrible idea. If you're a sponsor.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
So Jack's Reef. So these are kind of broad, squat points. These are they tend to be in two different kinds of forms. So there's these pentagonal points, which are kind of unstemmed, pentagonal in shape, and are probably preforms to the Jack's Reef corner notch point, which is again sort of a broad triangular shape with corner notching. You see these sort of in decreasing frequency the further north you go, but there's even, for example, Washtenamock Church, Jack's Reef Point from Queenstown, New Brunswick, so just across from Washtenamock Lake, which is really neat. But you do get kind of a characteristic point type in sort of the eastern part of the province, and into places like Nova Scotia and in PEI, where what's called a bipoint. And so these are projectile points or bifaces that are made. We talked about in the early woodland at the cache at Chickatahawk, these were bipointed lanceolate points that are very large, elaborate points. The bipoints that you tend to get in the middle woodland are smaller. These are probably like sort of 10 centimeters at most long, not very big, but they are pointed, so they're kind of leaf shaped, but they tend to be a little bit thicker than the early woodland bifaces. And you don't tend to see them in the southwest or in the northwest or into Maine, which is sort of interesting. You do see them in the lower Wastog, and you see them throughout eastern New Brunswick and PEI and into Nova Scotia. And in PEI and Nova Scotia, you get another sort of derivation of the bipoint, which is called the Tusket style point. And so it's not just bipointed, but it actually has barbs or flares or notches on the side of it, or shouldered. Kind of cool. I mean, they look like what you would sort of envision like a sort of a harpoon style point being. Which,
and they're kind of fat too, right? Like around the middle.
Yeah. And that so they're thicker in profile as well. So the bipoints in general are thicker points than elsewhere, which is sort of interesting too, because they're more robust than you would expect. For example, a bow and arrow point to be. Maybe they're more like something that was hafted into more like a dart or a spear point or something like that, or they're being used as knives. Is another possibility.
Yeah. So also my impression is about this period. Of course, lithic sourcing isn't real; it can't be trusted. We don't know where rocks come from. But if we accept the kind of if I accept Ken's ontology here and believe that rocks are real, my understanding and my perception from sites I've worked on. Actually, largely with Al Hansinger, who just had a paper accepted about this in Archaeology of Eastern North America.
Oh, fantastic!
Yeah, he did a nice job, but using combination of petrographic series, but also a lot of thin sections of flakes from a middle woodland site that were in the intertidal, and so got permission to section these and look at them, using sophisticated geological techniques. Was that at least on the coast, the materials we were seeing are overwhelmingly local. So they're like very nearby materials. Is that your perception of the middle woodland on the interior too?
Yeah, so there's actually, this is one of these things that like we don't always sort of have this cohesive pattern going on throughout the region, but certainly in the middle woodland, what you see is on the coast, you see kind of a retraction and sort of the early woodland, just to remind the listener, was characterized by a lot of exotic materials, so materials coming from away, some sort of broad exchange narratives. But by the middle woodland, what we're starting to see is there seemingly, at least in the patterning of the lithic materials, is sort of a retraction from these larger interaction spheres. And so what you're seeing is actually kind of clustering of localized materials. And so in the upper Wolastoq, so up in like Lac Témiscouata, up into sort of northwestern New Brunswick, the Tobic River area, northern Maine, you're getting sources for materials that tend to be staying closer to home. So material like we're not seeing lithics traveling as far. I work on Washtenamoc chert. What you see is a dramatic shift in Washtenamoc chert being everywhere in the early woodland, and then only in the lower Wolastoq in the middle woodland. And then it changes again in the late woodland, which we'll talk about next week. But certainly in New Brunswick, you're seeing the same thing. In places like on the East Coast, although quartz sort of dominates a lot of sites on the East Coast of New Brunswick, that is without question the most prevalent material at like Oxbow, for example, during the middle woodland component there, and at a number of like sites around there. And so what you're seeing is people are exploiting local materials from a bedrock source, but also increasingly more local cobble materials. And so they're not necessarily going to a source or getting exchanged material from a particular source. They're relying on sort of local materials to a higher degree. Yeah.
Cool. And I'll just speaking about typology, I'll put Adrian Burke's chapter about middle and late woodland period lithic forms in the show notes.
Yes, yeah, from the Far Northeast volume. Yeah.
Yeah. So Adrian's. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. So this was Adrian's sort of preliminary attempt at kind of building a projectile point chronology for the Maritimes. And what he sort of finds is that there are some themes, but it is kind of hard to tack down. Like it's not as simple as saying this means this and this means that, and that there does seem to be some patterning, as I talked about with the bipoints, for example, that there does seem to be a little bit of patterning, sort of northeast part of the Maritimes and the southwest of the Maritimes tend to kind of have a little bit different trajectory. And Brian Robinson kind of picked up on this back in the 90s when he was looking at, in particular, late woodland stuff, right?
And archaic stuff. He talked about in the woodland. He talked about where Levana points are. So where these, and a Levana point is a triangular shaped point, which we'll talk about next week as well. In Maine, we call them Levaner points. But we'll talk about those next week. But basically that they tend to be as you move into Maine, you actually don't find very many of those triangular point forms as you move into the Maritimes. But they are the dominant late woodland point form through New England.
Yeah, and in the Great Lakes, so you get Madison points.
Oh, yeah,
essentially kind of a different take on a Levana point. So
yeah, cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so that's kind of the themes when it comes to technology. So
cool.
So do you want to talk about some actual archaeological sites here?
I was going to say and some of them even from New Brunswick, actually.
There you go.
That
we did take some notes on.
I know, yeah. But the list. Ken and I are still doing this. We do the sites portion of this as kind of a free association game where we just list sites and we just fill in whatever we remember about them. And we might as well start on the coast, right? And I'm going to just kind of note again here that you're going to hear about these sites again because many of them, maybe all of the coastal ones, also have late woodland components, late maritime woodland components, which we're going to talk about next fortnight.
And I think a lot of the interior ones do too, but the late woodland stuff on the interior is harder to tack down because of filing and stuff.
Yeah, well, Ken and I have been legendarily successful at identifying late woodland sites on the interior with good, solid radiocarbon dates.
Yeah. I believe I set out to solve the conundrum of late woodland sites, and I had the hubris of thinking that my master's thesis was going to resolve an issue that by the end of it I realized, dug a hole for myself here, and I'm just going to ignore the fact that I tried to fix this.
But so on the coast, we've got these kind of classic deep shell heap sites, and part of the reason, actually, and part of the major contribution of one of the major contributions of Dave Black's work in New Brunswick, Matt Betts' work in Port Jolly, was to look at a wider range of sites. But it's totally understandable that guys like Richard Pearson and Dave Sanger, and actually even before that in the late 1800s, guys like G.F. Matthew would look at these really deep sites. And that's because you're trying to basically go after sites that have good preservation, that are really visible, and that have a lot of time in them, so that basically the bottom of the site is to the top of the site is going to build a lot of culture history. So these sites include ones like Holt's Point, Minister's Island, Sandy Point, Phil's Beach, or the Bokebeck site. And these are on the coast of New Brunswick. There's some notable things from these. One of them is that the Phil's Beach site was published in 1884 based on some 1883 fieldwork by G.F. Matthew, who we talked about way back, I believe, at our second ever NB ArcPod show when we were talking about the history of archaeology.
Yeah, I couldn't remember if Bokebeck was Middle Woodland or a Late Woodland site.
Well, it's a little hard to know, but I think it's got some Middle Woodland there.
Yeah.
And those are the first house floors reported from the region, and it's the site that the report that Bruce Trigger, kind of the probably the most important. He's sort of so important across so many different genres, including Egyptology. But he wrote this book called History of Archaeological Thought, which is it's on my bedstand right now, and but he, in a different book, in a review of 19th century archaeological research, described this as basically the best report of its time. Teacher's Cove is another example. It has house features. It's got Middle Woodland radiocarbon dates. Lots of shell. And then Minister's Island is a cool site. It's also got transitional Archaic, actually. Right, doesn't it? Yeah.
And an early woodland burial too, doesn't it?
That's right, yeah. And it's got Middle Woodland. And then once you go to the islands, you've got sites that Dave Black worked on: Partridge Island, the Weir site, the campsite, those kinds of sites. So, and they're very cool too. And we'll link to some of these in the show notes, some of the big accounts like Sanger's book and Dave Black's book.
Yeah.
These are the Daves I know, as Ken pointed out at the CAA a couple of weeks ago. And then tell us about the interior, Ken.
So there's a couple sites that we're going to highlight here. Again, you'll be familiar with Fulton Island we've talked about. Certainly the Middle Woodland component at Fulton Island is probably the largest, sort of successive number of different features, what appear to be probably, sort of larger features that are probably households. So wigwams, basically people living on the island in the summer. You have the Bullfrog site, which is a smaller archaeological site. It was excavated in the late 1980s by Scott Buchanan, and radiocarbon date from that sort of puts it right sort of in the middle of the Middle Maritime Woodland. So in using Susan Blair's Lower Lostow chronology, we're talking about periods 4 and 5, so the early and late Middle Maritime Woodland. So she was able to see basically a distinction between the early and late Middle Maritime Woodland, sort of changing strategies in terms of lithics and house floors and that sort of thing. The Meadows site, which is actually kind of one I want to highlight, sort of unique in that it was excavated under, as a part of a CRM project. So same highway twinning project. It was actually identified during monitoring, which is, for those of you who have ever done archaeological monitoring before, this is a bit of a feat to identify archaeological resources while a large excavator is removing soil. Very deep site. I seem to remember it starts at around like over 1.5 meters deep, something like that.
Didn't Darcy somehow manage to see a feature pouring out of the front end of a backhoe or something?
Was something like that, yeah. So it was basically like yeah, it wasn't an artifact; it was a cultural feature that they were able
That's
to
my
identify
recollection.
on. And now this is it's a fairly large site in that it's made up of a whole suite of features, one of which Sue calls Sample Unit 25, which is basically a cluster of 19 features arranged in a roughly oval shape. There's kind of interesting features within this larger feature. There's sort of flint knapping areas that are kind of in an arc shape, suggesting somebody was like sitting and actually making a stone tool. There's clusters of broken pottery. And the site's kind of interesting because what it looks like is potentially a ring of wigwams, sort of centered around kind of a negative space where there's almost no artifacts. And so maybe it was a place where people were, for example, gathering in the summer and, groups were dancing. It's also possible that it is one single structure, like it's a larger feature that's actually maybe more like a kind of like a longhouse, for example, right? We don't really know for sure, but it's certainly compelling in that there's sort of nothing else like it, and it's probably one of the largest feature clusters in the Maritimes that's ever sort of been uncovered as sort of a discrete unit. Radiocarbon dates from 3 different features actually kind of all line up and overlap and suggest that this was probably occupied at the same time, which is really neat. Got some other archaeological sites. So I think Egbahog, which is also known as Savage Island, near the head of tide. There's a number of sort of diagnostic Middle Woodland pottery from this site. We know that at least in the contact period or the post-contact period, this particular island was incredibly important to Wolastoqiyik and probably had been for millennia. This is a summer gathering area where ceremonies were held, and so certainly a site of some significance, fairly close to Kingsclear First Nation. And then further up river under the head pond, you've also got places like Meductic has a Middle Woodland component, and then you also have, jumping back down in around the Grand Lakes area, you've got the Gemseg site, which we've talked about before, and Oxbow, which is up in the Miramichi River. Again, fairly large Middle Woodland component. In fact, like I said, the bipoints that were recovered from there and a lot of the pottery from Oxbow has been kind of critical to understanding New Brunswick chronology as we sort of build culture history more broadly. And within the Lower Wolastoq itself, there's actually sort of some interesting patterning about site locations. So at Cow Point and at Ring Island, which are both places where we have evidence for late archaic moorhead cemeteries, you actually have Middle Woodland campsites there as well. And so there's particular places in the landscape that are being reoccupied, sort of shift from ceremonial landscapes to probably more just sort of habitation sites, basically. And I am sure that we are glancing over dozens of other sites. I don't have a particularly good grasp of the interior upper regions, but certainly one of the things that Adrian Burke points to in his dissertation is that as with elsewhere and as with the Lower Wolastoq, what you're starting to see during this time period is kind of a settling into these different regions, right? And so we talked about how lithics become kind of localized, and what we're seeing is that the Upper Wolastoq groups are sort of staying kind of operating in that region. The Middle Wolastoq we don't have a ton of data on, but we suspect that that's probably the same kind of thing going on. Within the Lower Wolastoq, what it appears is that groups are primarily sort of exploiting local resources. So at Bullfrog, for example, well over, what's the percentage here? It's something like 85% of the lithics are local or known or very likely local cobble sources. The same thing is going on at the
I prefer allegedly when we're talking about rocks, but
yeah, okay,
yeah.
So allegedly, but you're also seeing too the same thing like in the Quoddy region where you're seeing fewer exotic materials coming into the region, and so we don't really know what is precipitating this, or what sort of the causal factors are for sort of this retraction, but what we do see is people staying in places for a longer period of time, or staying within the regions for longer periods of time. And do you have any thoughts like what's going on there? I know that you and Matt have in your book have talked about, and this is something like Jim Tuck talked about years ago, in that sometime around 2,200 years ago, we start to see kind of the truest. We start to be able to speculate a little bit more about who these people were.
Hmm. Well, yeah. So I mean, I think that there's some interesting things that are going on in this period. I mean, and I think one of the things is that we start to see basically strategies that we would ordinarily associate with complexity start to kind of appear in a big way, for the first time since the late Archaic, right? Where we see evidence for aggregation, we see evidence probably for expanding population. We see, though, some of this is happening, like I think you mentioned, in a very local kind of environment, right? A very sort of localized, you sort of almost like defining themselves kind of in almost opposition to this big Hopewell stuff that's happening elsewhere. And that's, I mean, Matt's talked about that, that the degree to which people in the Maritimes probably like knew people who'd been, to see these sort of serpent mounds and things like that seems pretty likely, right? So you sort of, you have these ideas about how all these different, about your place in the world, right? And about what your identity is as opposed to that. I mean, I think, I mean, we you and me and Matt, certainly, other kinds of people kind of push these kind of continuity narratives. And I think that's another important thing to keep in mind, is that, we're very much talking about the ancestors of the contemporary Wabanaki people.
Yeah, and that's sort of what I was thinking of, is that, what you're seeing is sort of a very true expression of a Wabanaki identity that is, has been there all along, but is kind of seemingly for the first time sort of in contrast to other peoples around them, right? Or at least for the first time in a couple thousand years, that, you're seeing this kind of, we do things a little bit differently, and sort of a conscious decision to not participate in what are, big movements, like you said. Like, there's no way that these groups on the East Coast were not aware of what was going on, and I'm sure people within their society had been down to see what's going on, right? So yeah,
Yeah.
so maybe well, there's Washtenaw Chert in those mounds.
Well, Ken, I'm looking at a half-finished bottle of Courvoisier. So should we leave the listener on that note and then turn to our hit pieces?
I think that's probably a good idea.
Okay. And so you've got a hit piece here, the Mi'kmaq DeBert Cultural Center.
Yeah, hold on, I've got the wrong window open.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
We'll speak to our producer about this, listener. Don't worry.
Hold on. This is the problem with two computers. Oh.
The listener can see that Ken is staring furtively at one of the 8 monitors in front of him. It looks like in the movies where they've got somebody on the bridge and is trying to figure out where the dinosaurs have gone or something like that.
Yeah, this is the show notes are very helpful, but when you are looking for something on one screen, it's not on there. It's distracting. So while we were at the CAA, which was hosted by Member 2 First Nation, a fairly large presence from the Mi'kmaq DeBert group, which is the DeBert Palaeoindian site, as we talked about before. There is a community in that area, and there's also a sort of a group that has done a significant amount of work in that area. Lead archaeologist is Leo Rosenmeyer. So for a long time, they've got a series of trails in the area, some interpretive placards and that kind of thing. But for the long time, the goal has always been to build a cultural center. And so the Mi'kmaq DeBert Cultural Center is now actually slated to open in spring 2025. But some of that is contingent on them raising funds for the facility. The goal is for it to be a museum, education center, and a research and collections facility that will house Mi'kmaq DeBert or Mi'kmaq artifacts, and also encourage research with archaeologists and other folks. And so basically they are raising money to make the Mi'kmaq DeBert Cultural Center happen. This is a charitable foundation too, so donations will actually result in a tax receipt. We're going to link the website for it, mi'kma'ki-debert.com/donations, in the show notes. And we would encourage you to lend money toward this like really fantastic initiative, and something that I think all descendant communities probably on the East Coast would love to have, something that would be basically a repository and a research facility for community members, for archaeologists, and an opportunity for example, in this case, for Mi'kmaq to demonstrate and display and describe their own histories. And I think it's a really fascinating and fabulous idea, and really hope to see it happen. So
yeah, and one hopes maybe that it, just on a practical level too, will help to address the curation crisis in the Maritimes, basically running out of space to store archaeological materials. Well, that is
exactly.
great. Mine this week is also an example of an indigenous-led project, is my understanding, and this is a paper posted to the preprint service, and we'll link it in the show notes. But preprint service called SSRN, which I suspect means the paper will appear in its published form sometime soon. I think papers usually get posted to this SSRN when they're in review, and then eventually the final paper gets published. But this paper is called A Novel Index for Vulnerability Assessment of Archaeological Sites to Flood Hazard, Development, and a Practical Application in the Wabanaki Nation, Canada. And that's by Khalid Obanakor and colleagues. And so dealing with ways to try to basically quantify the risks that archaeological sites face due to floods forecast over the next various periods, various timescales, to use that as a management tool.
Yeah.
So it looks interesting.
Yeah, and very relevant too. Like in my own work,
Absolutely.
Storm frequency and flood frequency is definitely having a direct impact on archaeological resources. So Washamoak Lake, for example, the floods in 2018 and 2019 were bigger than they had ever been before, and as a result, I found a lot of stuff in the survey in 2019, and I think, and a lot of this stuff is coming from sites that were basically ripped apart from floodwaters, and that's the kind of thing. These 1 in 100-year floods seem to be happening with some frequency.
Yeah, well, that's the Canadian 100, which is and Ken, so in about a fortnight we will be back, and we will be talking about the late woodland.
That's my jam.
I know, it's both of our jams, actually. We're sort of late woodland enthusiasts. The late woodland's fun. It's when the woodland's fun in general.
It is, yeah.
As the listener will have gathered, because they turned this on, 8 hours ago, and Ken and I are still here. So, are you sick of us yet, listener?
They know about oysters. That's the...
Yeah. I mean, we're happy to give oyster recommendations. Well, thanks very much for tuning in, listener, and we will see you in about a fortnight. And thanks, as always, for listening, and take care.
Thank you, listeners. See you next episode.